we're going to start presenting Richard. You can all see Richard there. Richard not only is the farmer in this beautiful, beautiful place that he's going to be showing us pictures of and telling us about how he's been managing it, but he's also a consultant and has over 20 years of experience in conservation advisory work. He's also knows an awful lot about agricultural policy. So he's the guy to come to for all these questions. He's worked with the Farming and Wildlife Advisor Group, and he's a consultant. So you're a person to go if you ever have any questions, Richard. We're going to be sharing all his information as well in the mails. And then we're also going to hear, so he's going to be talking to us about his experience in his farm, how he's planting to diversify, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what diversify means. And then for anybody who has any questions about how the Scottish Forestry can help you turn your farm into a tree haven, or just to plant a couple of trees, Helen's going to be there and is going to walk us through the different grants available. So we're going to start with about an hour with Richard, then about 15 minutes with Helen, and then at the very end we're going to leave time for questions, which doesn't mean that you can ask questions throughout the whole presentation. Please do it as they come, because sometimes it's easier to just answer them at the moment. Just a really brief introduction. As you know, this event is called Planting Trees to Diversify Your Farm, and I think that it's important to highlight that when we say diversify, we mean it in a very wide sense. It's not only economical, but also how you can make it so that it's more biodiversity friendly, how you can have more activities and sort of like make your farm a space where communities can come together. And I think that that's one of the reasons why I'm really, really excited to be talking to Richard, because I think he's managed to do an incredible work in bringing all these different things together and really creating a space that's a farm, but much more than that. So we're going to start talking to you, Richard, then. You can unmute yourself and we can get started. Richard's going to be sharing some pictures as well. So if you want to see them as well afterwards, happy to share them. And so we're going to start. Richard, could you tell us a little bit about Knockbairn Farm, where it is, just the general more fiscal aspects of it, and then what's your story with it, your relationship and your family's relation, because I know that it's a long one.
Sure. Thanks, Anna, and morning, everyone. Thanks for joining today. A bit of background about Knockbairn Farm, then. We're just outside the town of Dingwall in the Highlands of Scotland, on the very east coast, just north of Inverness. The farm is about 200 hectares in total. Of that, probably 50 hectares, I would say, is woodland and forestry, obviously, which we'll be talking about today. The remaining 150 hectares, roughly, is divided into different parts. I manage about 50 hectares myself in hand with a small farming operation that we'll talk a bit about, and two other sections are rented out to neighbouring farms at the moment. So that's kind of where we are. I'll show a map at some point, and I don't know when you want me to start sharing the.
You can start sharing immediately if you want to.
Right. Why don't I do that? And there's a map that I can share, hopefully. Tell me if you can you see that? Is that working?
Yes.
Great, super. So yeah, and as Anna said, I should point out that I'm not a forester. I'm not a qualified forester. I'm not a proper farmer, whatever that means. My day job is I work as a freelance land management advisor. I do that 5 days a week. So what I'm going to talk about today is what I fit in around my other work, which means that it's constrained by time. And but I think probably that's something that we're all familiar with. Actually, it's a universal thing. So just to make sure that no one's under the misapprehension that I'm a full-time farmer or forester or anything, the consultancy is the day job, and this is what I'm doing in the evenings and weekends, I suppose. So I'll skip on to this map, shall I? Yeah, so hopefully you can see there's the town of Dingwall. Does the cursor work for people to see, Anna, or if I move it around, maybe not.
Yes, we can
Yeah,
see
okay, you could see that. Yeah, so yeah, here's Dingwall, and this is the road out to Strathpeffer. If you're familiar with this area, the main farm just nearer the town, some 2 or 3 arable fields, but the rest is fairly, and we'll come on. I've got some photographs of the landscape, which is fairly undulating, quite a lot of north-facing, unproductive ground. But it's predominantly grassland, really. I mean, that's what this farm grows particularly well, is grass and trees in some areas.
So can you tell me a little bit more about your family relationship with the farm?
Yeah, I was. My dad bought this farm in 1971, and I was born up here and grew up on the farm. Then I left to go to university and worked for 15 years in Perthshire for FWAG, Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group. And then when that ceased to exist, I set up my own consultancy in 2009. So yeah, and that was still in Perth, but then we decided, my wife and I decided to move back to the farm in about 2015. So Susie works as a primary school teacher. My mum and dad are sort of moving towards retirement, I suppose. And yeah, so we've been here 5 years, kind of full time. So we're still kind of getting the hang of things. And but in that time I was away, I was still doing stuff on the farm. We were still planting trees and working away on that kind of side of things.
So how long has your family been planting trees, and how did it change when you moved there?
To be honest, Dad started planting trees pretty much when he moved here. In fact, the next slide shows, and this, I'm sorry, it's an awful picture, but this is pretty much when Dad bought the farm in 71. And it looks awful. It was pretty, yeah, it is pretty bleak. Not many trees, and yeah, so he set about, as everyone did in those days, getting it into a more productive state, doing a lot of drainage and fencing work, which you can see the drainage going in there. But and what he also did then was to plant blocks of trees to improve the shelter. But this was the 70s, and blocks of trees aren't what blocks of trees are now. They were, and again, I've hopefully got some pictures to show you. They were geometric blocks of Sitka spruce, so they didn't look great, but they served a purpose. And at that time, it was improving shelter, and it was like it is for all of us. We're kind of learning as we go, and things have progressed since then. So that's how it started off, really.
So afterwards, that was your dad planting and everything, and then you came along with all your ideas. And what happened?
Yeah, so I got interested in this kind of thing, and this picture gives another. This is taken about 2000, so 20 years ago, and you can see where the trees have been established gradually over time. The farm, if you can see the cursor, extends roughly where I'm showing, down to the bottom of the valley here, and here's some of these blobs of Sitka spruce that were planted in the early days. They've pretty much all gone now, and I've got pictures of that. But then there's this next stage of planting was more native broadleaves, perhaps better integrated with the landscape, and going up this central riparian strip up the middle of the farm. And again, we'll talk a bit about that. So that's what Dad did, and then I kind of picked up in about 2000, and really built on this framework, I suppose, and we've been adding to that ever since, and pretty much every year putting in trees in some shape or form. Not always native broadleaves. I'll go on to talk about some of the more productive plantations that we've put in. That's native broadleaves is mostly what we've been putting in. But yeah, there are some more productive woodlands that we're developing.
Do you have a main motivation when you're thinking about planting trees? Is it for production? Is it for shelter? Or is it more for biodiversity? Or you've been managing to make it so that it covers a little bit of everything at every point?
I think it is a little bit of everything for us. That's the great thing about trees and woodland, actually, is they can deliver so much in so many different areas. I think initially it was well, as I said, it was about shelter, but then it was making a more attractive landscape. And then it's become more about wildlife and improving wildlife habitats. It's become about carbon storage. It's become about flood protection, which again we'll talk about a little bit. And this is an evolving thing. Like I feel like I'm learning all the time. I think the next stage is going to be how we integrate trees with farming. That's something we don't do very well here at the moment, and I'm really keen to do that. It's something that's become much more interesting, and I've got some ideas that I'll share, and hopefully other people can chip in, because I think this is something we're all learning about as well.
In general, what would you say? How is your planning process for creating more trees? Because it feels like some people go into it and do it in one go, but you've been doing it in little bits and pieces, which kind of makes it harder to imagine the whole picture.
Yeah, in fact, I'll just skip on. Just just I show you some pictures of my ling cattle because I like them. So yeah, and these are some of the cows. These are some of the heifers born last year in a wildflower meadow in the summer. So yeah, that's just me indulging myself. But it's important to me, and it's also important to what we're going to talk about, integrating livestock and trees. But I thought it'd be useful to share this picture because it kind of illustrates the principles behind my thinking. So when my dad took over the farm, it looked like this picture at the bottom, really. A very simplified landscape, and not much species diversity, not much structural diversity, and general interest. And what motivates me is moving up this scale, if you like, of diversity, and integrating more woodlands, but not just woodlands, more habitats and features in the farmed landscape to make it more diverse for obviously for wildlife, but for all sorts of other things. But it also makes it more resilient, I think, to things like heavy rain, drought, and all the other things that we are affected by. Disease, we'll come on to talk about. That's something we've had a problem with trees. So that's the underlying principle, if you like. Beyond that, I have to say it's pretty haphazard, if I'm honest. I've got to know the place well over time, and that takes time to get to know your place and your environment. And I just working from first principles, I kind of instinctively like to think I have a rough idea of where I want to get to. And then it's just how much time and resource I have available to do the next stage. So it'd be nice to say that I've got a fantastic 10-year plan that we're working through, but that would be a complete lie. It is just that evolving picture. And I think in my experience, that's the reality for most people doing farm woodlands. It's totally different for commercial woodland managers. I get that, and you have to be really organized and plan, everything that you're doing. But that isn't probably the case for us here.
Here's an interesting question from Catherine, which is aligned with what we're talking about, is whether you engage with professional foresters to help you plan your woodlands.
I did at the start. but so yes, I have done. But the advantage I have is I kind of do this stuff as my day job. Forestry isn't my main part of my day job. By the way, I'm not a forest advisor or anything. It's more farm conservation. But I did woodland grant scheme applications and forestry grant scheme applications. So I think if you're starting out, it's going to be important to get that that expert advice in. But as time goes on, and this is how it worked for us, for me, I became more confident and I can do it myself. But yeah, I do still bring in expertise when we need it, certainly.
That's great. So you get started, you decide you're going to be planting trees. What were your initial challenges?
So if I'll just share these pictures again. This is, well, just I suppose it shows the evolution which we've talked about already. This is more or less from the same viewpoint. Again, this is a early 70s photo, and not much of interest here. This is probably 2000. These pretty poorly designed blocks of spruce, and then you can start to see the evolution of that. We've started to try and link this area in with this woodland and put some hedges in, and this is how it looked yesterday. I'm sorry, that's not a brilliant, but the light was fading in the evening, so that block of spruce has gone. This has become really well established and integrated. These spruce trees in here have actually, they went last year. So yeah, so that's how it's evolved. I think I've got another sort of similar picture. This is 15 years ago. Another block of woodlands, my dad and Susie, and this was it last night again. And it's interesting to see that change actually over time. When I was just digging out some old photos to see, and yeah. So sorry, Anna, I've kind of digressed. I can't remember what your question was.
No worries at all. It's actually, it relates to this, so it's absolutely fine. So you decided to start planting, and you must have had like your initial challenges, especially considering that you had kind of a white canvas, but then you had the sickest spruces all over.
Yeah, I suppose so. But the challenges are the challenges that everyone has. I think that how once you've decided what to establish and where, it's how to do it, and the things that stop that happening, like things eating the trees primarily, yeah. So how best to protect trees from deer? There's lots of roe deer on the farm, and we've done that in different ways. In this instance, it was tree tubes. Obviously, that's worked really well. If I skip back, actually, this woodland we did, we didn't actually use tubes or deer fence actually, and we got away, as you can see, just those trees got established well without any protection at all. More recently, we've put in some bigger native woodlands with deer fencing. That's just essential. So I'd say that's the biggest challenge, alongside just working out how to integrate woodlands effectively with the farm. So you're not taking up vast amounts of ground, and it's not too fiddly, and making sure it stacks up economically. We're obviously in the fortunate position where there's pretty reasonable grant incentives to do the work, but depending on how you do it, you might find that it's still at cost to you, or the other way around. I think in our case, it's probably worked out both ways. Sometimes we've done okay, particularly when we've done more of the work ourselves, and sometimes it's cost us, but it's an investment, I suppose, in many respects.
I see a question from Jude, who's asking if you did any soil analysis to know which trees would do best on your land.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's so many good tools and information out there. If I could reach it on my bookshelf, there's the quite old now Forestry Commission Guide to Establishing New Native Woodlands, which tells you the different NVC types of woodland, so the National Vegetation Classification types of woodland that are appropriate on different soil types and different climates. The Scottish Forestry have their ecological site classification tool, which is also quite good to get climate information for your site. And I'm starting to stray into those who are expert foresters kind of expertise, but that is useful for telling you what might be appropriate in your situation. And then you're looking at maybe soil maps, and I think less so soil testing, because in a disturbed environment like this, the soil nutrient status is going to be relatively high, because it's been fertilized in the past and things. But yeah, that's still relevant to know that. So yeah, I suppose it's about pulling together the information, and I think that's so important. The old adage of getting the right tree in the right place, and spending time figuring that out either yourself or getting someone to help with that is really important.
That's great. We're going to be sharing all the resources you just mentioned in the follow-up email for people to have. So I think that this is an interesting question Catherine is asking, if you have fully integrated agroforestry areas in your land at the moment.
No, and something I want to talk about, and I can do it now if you'd like, Anna. Yeah, okay, let me just skip through some pictures. We'll come back to these. Yeah, so I mean, in principle, this is one of my heifers. We were just moving them, and it's amazing how cattle gravitate to trees, to browse on them, to lie underneath them when it's wet or when it's hot and sunny, and I don't think that's something we have really got to grips with yet properly. There are some people doing some really interesting work on agroforestry and silver pasture, but they're the pioneers, if you like, and that has lots of other interesting links. For example, at the moment, if you're on social media, the people at How Mill Farm in Aberdeenshire are really interesting what they're doing, integrating trees and cattle, and they've got a series of videos this week sort of showing how they're doing that and what they're doing. That's actually linked to a mob grazing project, which the Soil Association are leading on, as I'm sure you know, which I think it also has scope to integrate into this sort of agroforestry silver pasture thinking. So yeah, it's so for me, it's look, it's a good thing. We should be doing more of it. So it's how to do it, and whether it's on the more intensive scale, where you might maybe in this image here, where it's trees with really quite productive grassland, or whether it's a more extensive wood pasture type of grazed environment. In both cases, they're really important from a biodiversity point of view. This kind of extensive wood pasture type of system is going to be really valuable. So yeah, so here, I mean, this is example of some of my first efforts. This went in a couple of years ago. This is a standard length rail, 3.4 meters by 3.4 meters. It's ridiculously high, because cattle just lean over everything. It's too flimsy. It's amazing. It's stood up for the last 2 years because they break things if they're not strong enough, and it's also ridiculously expensive. I mean, you can do the sums yourself about how much that would cost in terms of fencing materials alone. I've got 6 trees in there. Probably get a bit of scrub type, in there as well eventually. But that's not, I don't think, a sustainable option. So this winter, I've just bought, and some of you might be familiar with cactus guards. This is obviously isn't Knockbairn Farm. I think it's Spain, where they have these fantastic wood pasture environments, the Hesha scrub environments, where they are really good at integrating livestock and cattle. But this is where this cactus guard comes from, and it's basically, I've got 10 in the yard here. They cost £10 each, and it's 3 lengths of rebar, reinforced bar hammered into the ground, and you bend this mesh around the rebar. It's got lots of spiky bits on it, and it's got a bit of flex in it. And if it works, I think that could be a game changer when it comes to integrating trees in a more conventional farm environment, because it's, in theory, it is cheap. As I say, £10 a go, and hopefully not too hard to install. I haven't put any in yet, so I'm reserving judgment, but I have read some information of people who have put them in, and it sounds quite promising. Yeah, that's where we're at. I mean, if I'm being critical of where we're at in terms of incentives for woodlands, this is a big gap. There isn't any really to speak of to do this kind of thing, which is strange considering that all the benefits there are in terms of biodiversity, landscape, carbon storage, and livestock productivity and that kind of thing. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question where we've got to.
So one of the reasons then that you're planting trees is for your animals. What other reasons do you have to plant trees at the moment, and how is it going?
Well, I tell you, if I skip back a few slides, this isn't a primary motivation for us planting trees, but obviously trees have a beneficial effect on the impacts of flooding. And this is last summer, where we had 50 mils of rain in an hour. This is the burn that goes through the farm. That's not soil erosion. That's just the churn of the burn going down the woodland gully. So it's going through woodland habitat. But this burn did flood the town. That wasn't just because of the burn. There was actually a blocked culvert, because the culvert goes under the town, and the volume of rain, it couldn't go through the culvert. But this impact we're seeing in the town was from that burn, believe it or not. I'd say we're not responsible, but I sort of think, well, we've got to do everything we can to help mitigate against that. So that's become more of a motivation, I think, for tree planting. I think I've got some images of. So this image on the bottom is the kind of thing we're doing. So just straightening out fence lines. The old fence lines went, these crazy zigzags down the very top of a bank, at the bottom of a field, and you're replacing strainer posts every 10 years all the time, and it's a nightmare to maintain. Branches fall on the fence. Just pull that fence back, straighten it right out, and improve that riparian habitat, and that buffer, and hopefully help to mitigate some of these flooding issues. This scheme was funded through forestry grant scheme, planted last year. The photos above it are kind of illustrate what I suppose I'm trying to achieve. I think this is Tweed Foundation photos from down in the borders, and really well illustrate how riparian woodlands can make a big difference. And you can imagine the difference that small amount of woodland is going to make from a flooding point of view. But also these are the benefits, like landscape. Someone called it creating a more textured landscape, which I really like the idea of. So I think that's something kind of moving towards. Again, and I don't want to appear to be overly critical of the grant scheme. I don't think it's brilliantly geared up for riparian woodlands, because we have this minimum 15-meter width requirement. I don't know if this was funded through what scheme it was funded through, and maybe it meets the requirement, but sometimes in a farm situation you want to widen a riparian margin, but you don't want to take out 15 meters of a field, because that's quite a lot in some instances. So I think that's something we perhaps could be doing better, but the principle is there. So that's another motivation, if you like.
So we have animals, we have flooding. What else?
So productivity is another one. These are some of the commercial spruce woodlands that my dad planted in this case the early 80s. They got felled last year, and the timber price at that time was very healthy. So that was an interesting exercise for us to see how I suppose profitable in some instances productive woodlands can be. This is Sitka spruce that was thinned. It's 35 years old, and it was good timber. That's not going to be restocked with spruce. It's too small really to justify it. So that'll be natural. That will naturally regenerate, hopefully, in the 5 years that we've got for that process to happen. But we've also planted, we did about 5 years ago, we just had a 1 hectare or 1 or 2 hectare awkward field where we decided to go for a productive broadleaf woodland and put in a mix of ash, cherry and sycamore, planted at a very high density. I can't remember, I think it was something like 3,000 stems per hectare. And it's established amazingly well, and we're at the stage now where we're starting to think about pruning and how to do that. And the sycamore and the cherry are looking fantastic, but it's got ash dieback, and over a third of those trees are ash, and we have to plan for the fact we're going to lose them all, which is obviously a great shame. But everyone's got that problem. But yeah, so I think it's important for us to try and integrate some more productive woodlands, and that's an interesting exercise in itself. And it's not going to be immediately profitable. It's a really long-term thing, but it will produce firewood over in the initial sort of thinning years. We use wood fuel for all our heating and hot water and so on. So that's helpful. So yeah, whilst native woodlands are our mainstay, I'm not totally wedded to that, and we're keen to do some other things as well.
Sounds brilliant. So again, let me retrace: animals, flooding, production.
Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, the other thing to say is, I mean, if I've got some pictures, I'm not averse to getting rid of trees that were planted in the wrong place as well. And in this instance, this is a dated photograph on the left here, but this field was used by lapwings for breeding in the past, not in my memory, but it was drained, ploughed, and blocks of spruce were planted next to it. So it's just a death knell for breeding lapwings. And in this instance, I was convinced that we didn't want trees in that situation. So we cut them all down. We blocked ditches and made a wetter, more open environment that is attractive to breeding lapwing. And it's amazingly, it has actually worked. This is the sort of main field, and this is this year one of our chicks that fledged this year. And yeah, so I suppose the point I want to make is it's really important to be aware of the fact that it isn't always the right thing to do to plant trees in a situation, and this is a good example of where it was it was a good idea at the time, and no criticism of anyone, but you know, we've learned lessons. So those trees were cut down, and we had to do compensation planting elsewhere for that because of the felling license requirements. Yeah, and well, Anna, just the other point I was going to make in association with your question was managing woodlands in a better way. I think one thing we're guilty of here, and you see quite often, is we plant trees and then don't really do very much after planting the trees. And this is I actually took this last night as well. A woodland established 15 years ago, and it's fine. You know, it's well established, but it does look a bit like this sketch on the bottom. And my objective when it comes to biodiversity is to make the woodlands look more like this. Obviously, that's not going to happen for a long time, but starting to think about how to manage woodlands more effectively and actively for biodiversity. But that could be linked to other things like having livestock in here for short periods of time, doing some coppicing, doing some thinning, doing some underplanting, whatever, to increase that diversity. So that's, as well as the agroforestry, I think that's the kind of the next thing that we're keen to do more, and that's probably become more of a motivation for us.
How do you manage then? Is it just about making sure that you know your space really well and coppice when it needs coppicing, or does it involve creating smaller habitats, if you want, within the different spaces of farm? How are you thinking about managing this trees?
That's a good question. The problem is it's being constrained by time, actually, you know, and resource. You know, if I could, I would do lots of this kind of thing, but I just don't have the time to do it. So I think if you can identify the highest priority areas and things to do that are going to make the biggest difference and focus on that, is probably the answer to that question. And that just takes a bit of time to get to know your situation and your environment and figure it out. And I think it's also important to enjoy it as well. You know, if you're not enjoying what you're doing or getting satisfaction out of it, your motivation is much less, especially when it's these things that are quite uneconomic, really. So yeah, it's another consideration.
I had a question that someone asked me beforehand that that they would like answered, and it's all about tree species and how did you select the species for your farm, and what has worked and what hasn't. You were talking about the ash there, but if you could expand on that.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the first things that I did, and I recommend to other people to do, is to look around what's growing. If you've got semi-natural woodlands, see what's growing in them and what's growing in remnant bits of woodland and tree lines and scrub, because that gives you a decent clue. So in our case, unfortunately it's ash and elm, which is two of the main tree species, both of which are now severely affected by disease. But there are obviously a wide range of other trees in our situation that are appropriate. So yeah, looking at what you've got there at the moment, and then looking at some of these other the guidance that I mentioned before, like the Establishing Native Woodlands book by the Forestry Commission, and some of the online guidance tools like the ecological site classification tool, that kind of thing. And there are probably other things that I can't think of off the top of my head, but yeah.
We'll include them afterwards, that's fine.
Yes, yeah. Just I remember the elm, just while we're talking about the elm, we've got some fantastic wych elm down the main burn of the farm they're all dying of Dutch elm disease over the last 5 years. And that creates a kind of headache in itself. But and we're going to leave lots for standing and fallen deadwood, which is probably the most important component of a woodland wildlife habitat anyway. But we have taken some out. We sold some, and this is what it looked like when it went on the sawmill. This is Logie Steading over near Forres, if any of you're familiar with their new sawmill operation, which is fantastic. So we sold some of the elm to them, but we've kept a little bit back to make a table out of, and this was it on the mill. And yeah, that was another really interesting experience, just to see that process working through. It's been in the kiln now for, I think it's coming out next week. It's been in the kiln for 6 months, but yeah, it was kind of satisfying to see it. Yeah, the disease as a disaster, but there's a silver lining to that cloud. The ash dieback is another issue. We've stopped planting ash, but obviously, and the mature ash are fine at the moment, but it's the younger planted ash that are dying back, unfortunately.
So I think that this sort of, like you mentioned there, that that you were going to leave a lot of the deadwood because it's important for woodland habitats and everything, and that sort of like takes us to a question that I think is really interesting. It's how do you balance tree planting with the creation and management of other important wildlife habitats?
Yeah, the really good question. Yeah, and the way I look at it is a kind of hierarchy, if you like, because from a wildlife point of view, I think habitats like wetlands, ponds, species-rich wildflower meadow type habitats, maybe scrub and wood pasture, are more valuable from a biodiversity point of view than woodlands. So if I've got or have potential to create some of those types of habitats for wildlife, I would do those first, which sounds strange when we're talking about woodland creation, but woodland creation undoubtedly is a good thing from a biodiversity point of view. But I think it's lower down the list of things that you would consider doing. When people often talk about planting up wet, boggy corners and things, my first reaction is, hang on, that might be quite a nice little bit of wetland habitat, for example. So it isn't, or it might be fine to plant with trees, but it isn't always the main consideration. And also for species, particularly of birds, wading birds in particular, trees are just a total disaster. And I'm not going to attribute the declines in curlew and lapwing throughout Scotland to creation of woodland. There's all sorts of factors at play there, but it has contributed to it, and to an extent still does. Curlew require extensive areas of open ground, and even a small area of woodland in good curlew breeding habitat can be pretty disastrous. If you want to learn more about that, just read Patrick Laurie's brilliant book called Native, about curlew in Dumfries and Galloway and the impacts of woodland down there. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question in a roundabout way. But I see it as a kind of hierarchy, if you like.
This is a really good question from Melanie, who's asking if you do biodiversity surveying prior to and after woodland planting to monitor changes, and if you do, which species do you survey?
The short answer is not really, and that's a cop-out. It's one of those things I think would be great to do, and if you can, I would definitely encourage it. I would probably use the time excuse again for the reason that we don't. And I would also like to think, I hope I have a reasonable feel for the appropriateness or otherwise of woodland. I'm sure I'm probably still making mistakes, undoubtedly. But even just doing at its most basic level, just doing walkovers to see what's there botanically. If you've got something resembling a wildflower species-rich grassland type habitat or something that could be, then trees are probably not going to be the best answer in that situation. So getting to know what more diverse species-rich grassland looks like, what more valuable wetland habitats look like, and there's lots of quite good guidance, I think, available on the web for that. So that would be a really good starting point. This, and then, yeah, and also doing the same thing, looking at perhaps how valuable an area is for species that would be adversely affected by tree planting, like ground nesting birds and things. So that can be quite informal, just having a good walk around or a few walks around, or you can do something more involved, which is also great, and there's different methodologies for doing that as well.
Is there one that you would recommend, or anything that pops to mind?
It depends what you're. I suppose it depends what you're looking for. There's all sorts of walkover survey methodologies for birds. Phase 1 habitat survey, for example, which is a basic habitat survey where you're sort of mapping what you've got into different categories of grasslands, and that's divided up into different types of species-rich grassland potentially. So if you've got base-rich grassland, acid grassland, so that would be maybe if you want to get more in depth into doing habitat survey. A phase 1 is often what people would start off doing, but I suppose you do have to have a degree of botanical knowledge to do that, but it's a great way to learn is actually by getting out there and starting to do it.
I think that we're starting to come to a close, so I think there's a couple of really good questions that have come up. Jude is asking, what size of trees do you plant, and have you found that getting them at a certain size increases chance of survival, both depending on the weather, but also considering animals?
Yeah, good question. It'd be a question for a forester, really. We buy cell-grown saplings that are 20 to 40 centimeters, and that works well for us. I don't know the merits of buying bigger trees. They're more expensive. You're often constrained by what's available from a nursery anyway. I personally don't think it makes a huge amount of difference. Probably what makes much more of a difference is weed control, and this is a bad example of weed control. Well, it's a bad example of a few things, but it's a bad example of weed control. These got screefed, so they, you kind of whack the grass away with a spade, basically, around the base of the tree to minimize the competition. But I expect foresters looking at this would be a bit horrified, saying, well, we need to have some more grass control going on here. So yeah, but tree size, I don't think it's probably constrained by what you can get as much as anything, because trees are harder to get now because there's so much demand for tree planting. But I don't think you could go wrong with a 20 to 40 centimeter sapling rather, if you were doing some reasonable weed control. I do apologize. This is a classic example of what I was talking about, planting trees where this blackthorn scrub is just going to spread over all of this area. So what were we doing planting that? I don't know. Yeah.
I think that leads us really well into sort of like the next question, which is, it's easier to sort of like see where you're going with it, but looking back, what would you have done differently?
I'd have loved to have done more faster, actually. Because I mean, I look at things now and think, oh, I wish I'd done that 10 years ago. The stuff that I'm doing or starting to think about doing now.
For example?
Well, the agroforestry, for example, I really wish we'd started on that thinking 10 years ago. And also, I enjoy planting, in corners of fields, just small areas of woodland where it's appropriate in the landscape, doing more of that, which doesn't cost anything. A tree, a tube, and a stake costs £2. You put 10 in a corner of an arable field, just where it's awkward anyway. But I do wish I'd done more of that sooner, because they make I think they make quite a difference. The flip side of that is if you rush ahead too much, you make more of the mistakes that we have undoubtedly made. So perhaps there's an advantage there is an advantage to taking your time. I wish we'd known about things like tree diseases as well. If obviously if we'd have known that ash we're going to die, that's we wouldn't have planted them. But if you're doing it now, you've got the advantage of knowing that, I suppose.
That's really good. And just to close this part, and then we're going to go to Helen, but then we'll come back for more questions. So don't think you're off the hook just now. What are the main things that you've learned about planting trees?
There's probably too many to list. I enjoy it. I find it really satisfying and rewarding. It's one of these things. It's a long-term process, and there's something enjoyable about just watching things evolve and develop. And for me, that's probably the most important thing. That you want to be doing things, particularly if you're doing it in your spare time, that you enjoy. What else have I learned? Just getting the right tree in the right place is a really good starting point, I suppose. And that there's no one answer for everywhere. Each site and location has its own bespoke, specific requirements, I think, and you need to just figure that out.
Know your land.
Yes.
So thanks so much, Richard. Again, as I mentioned, I still have a couple questions to go that have been arriving, but I think that it's a good moment to stop for a wee while and learn more about the grant schemes with Helen. So Helen, if you're around. And again, thanks so much for that first part, Richard, but I'm not going to go overboard just yet because there's still to come. So Helen, do you want to do the honors and take over?
Yeah, I'll see if I can get my presentation to work. So hopefully you can see that okay.
No, it's not loading yet, at least for me.
Maybe
there it goes.
Press the right button this time. Yeah, my name's Helen. I'm a woodland officer with Scottish Forestry, and I cover the kind of north beat of Highlands and Islands Conservancy. So for me, that means I cover the Black Isle and up into Caithness and Sutherland and Orkney as well. The Conservancy covers right out to the kind of west of the Highlands and the Western Isles, and we also cover Shetland. There's our trees on Shetland, despite what some people might think. So yeah, we cover a big area, so a lot of different site types, lots of different things going on. So yeah, so woodland creation, similar to kind of some of the things that Richard's already talked about. There's lots of reasons why you might want to put woodland on your farm or croft. So that could be creating shelter for livestock, expanding existing bits of woodland. You've maybe got remnant ancient woodland on the site or nearby which you want to kind of build on. It could be that there's pieces of land which aren't very suitable for agriculture, or as Richard was saying, you know, sort of awkward corners of fields which are difficult for machinery or things, so you can maybe plant them. Could also be for landscape and biodiversity, things like increasing habitat for certain animals and things. Climate change is obviously a big thing at the moment, so planting woodland can help with, you know, sequestering carbon and contributing to that. And it could be a long-term investment, either through improving the land or also potentially getting a bit of firewood or productive timber off the site in the future. There's a lot of things to consider when you're planting woodland, so these are just a few of the kind of key points, I suppose. So it's about, what do you want from your woodland? What are you trying to achieve? How much time and investment can you put into the woodland? There is a financial cost to planting it, and there are grants to help with that, but it doesn't, the grants might not cover all of the costs depending on the site. So as Richard was saying, sometimes you might make a little bit spare, but other times it might cost you a bit. So it, you know, sort of weighing up that balance. Also, have you got the knowledge and the time to manage the project yourself, or do you bring in an expert to help you maybe do the grant application, maybe bring someone in to do the planting, etc. Is the land suitable for planting? So there's various things. You need to actually have a depth of soil that the trees can grow in. One of the other requirements is that you don't plant on deep peat. We have quite a lot of that in the Highlands, so making sure that the site is suitable and that it's complying with regulations around things like deep peat, because that's designed to protect that, because that's an important habitat in itself. Also considering the size of your project, new planting has usually got to be consulted on. There might be stakeholders that have comments, things they want to input, and if the project is generally larger than 20 hectares, then we have to do an environmental impact assessment screening. Quite often for woodland, we can work through that process and you won't require a full environmental impact assessment to be carried out. But, you know, the design can address any issues that might be there, but it's just something to consider when you're coming up with the plans. So there's a link here. Obviously, you'll get this presentation after, when everything gets sent out. So there's loads of information on our website. There's lots of different facets to the forestry grant scheme, so worth taking a look at the website, just having a read through the different options, and the two booklets that are there, and the application guidance and supporting information guidance, they're both on the website as well, so they're really useful to have a look at. So for woodland creation, there are 9 different categories of funding, depending on what type of woodland you're creating. So hopefully you can see these okay. They're quite small. So you've got conifer, diverse conifer, broadleaves, native Scots pine, native upland birch, native broadleaves, native low density, smaller farm woodlands, and native broadleaves in the Northern and Western Isles. This final option, the Northern and Western Isles option, that can also be used in other areas of the crofting counties. So that's a slightly higher payment rate, but you do have to plant higher density, and there's a limit on the size of woodland you can plant. It's aimed at sites that are maybe more exposed, maybe a little bit trickier to establish. So loads of different options, and it really will depend on what's suitable for your site. But that's the kind of thing that you can get in touch with your local woodland officer and they can give you a little bit of advice and maybe come out and have a look at the ground and talk through based on what your objectives are, but also what the site's like, what might be suitable for you to apply for. The way the grant system works is that the capital costs is paid once you've completed the planting. So there is an initial upfront cost for you to purchase the trees and fencing materials. And then once you've completed the project, you can claim that money back essentially. And then there is an annual payment for 5 years, which is claimed through SAF, and that is aimed at maintaining the woodland. So if you've got to maybe replace any failed trees, or if you've got to do some weeding or maybe some fertilizing, that's designed to cover that cost. And obviously it's money that you're kind of being given to establish a woodland, so there is a contractual commitment to maintain that woodland until it's established. So that's something to be aware of. One of the grant options that we also have is sheep and trees. So that's aimed at livestock farmers where sheep is a major component of the farm business. And that is for conifer or diverse conifer plantings, limited to 50 hectares. But it's tied together with our infrastructure grant where you can get money to put in a new access track or road. And that's designed that the road is put in when you're creating the woodland, so that you've then got the long-term access for managing that woodland, but also then ultimately thinning it and harvesting it in the future. So that's another one that might be of interest. This year we've also managed to secure an extra £1 million of grant funding, and that is supporting farm woodlands, particularly for riparian and shelter belt planting. So that's looking at diversifying farms, generating a bit more income potentially for farmers, and that is time limited though, so that's for projects which could be completed by the 31st of March 2021. So we can potentially put that funding towards slightly higher cost applications and things like that. So again, if you're already thinking about a project and you think you might be able to get it done in that time, there is more funding available this year. I think Richard mentioned this in his presentation, but yeah, the key thing is the right tree in the right place and for the right reasons. So making sure it fits around your objectives on your land, but also that the tree is suitable for the site, so that it will actually grow well and give you your desired outcomes. That's pretty much it. So a couple more links on here. The Conservancy mailbox is on there. So there's a little map just down in the bottom corner here. This shows the kind of Conservancy boundaries. It's actually a very bad map because it's chopped off the Northern Isles. I apologise, I missed that when I was putting this together. But yeah, if you want to get in touch with your local office, they can put you in contact with the woodland officer who covers your area, and they can give you a bit more advice on the specifics. It's kind of tricky to go into all the details of all the different options because there's so many different elements which may or may not apply depending on your site. So best thing to do is get in touch with the local office. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Helen. Another Helen here is mentioning that the grant rates are exclusive of VAT. So if you're not VAT registered, they will probably pay you about 20% lower than your actual cost. So I'm wondering if that's the case. How does it work? Or
so that's, I think, only on certain elements. A lot of the grant rates are standard capital costs, so it's a fixed rate that we pay. So that rate doesn't account whether you're VAT registered or not, but there are certain options if you're applying for actual costs. So if you've got a really expensive scheme, you could maybe apply for actual costs. So, for example, if your fencing was on a difficult site and was going to cost a lot more than what the standard grant rate was, you could apply for actual costs, but that's then when the VAT thing comes into play. So again, it's looking at how the finances of the project stack up and what works best for you.
Great. So we still have about 15 minutes for questions. So if you want to start sending them, please feel free. Or if you want to ask them directly, just raise your hand and I'll make sure to shout your name out and you can just go. But I think we can start with Richard. And so there's a really important question here that is around the community and how do you engage the community with this idea of planting trees and creating more trees. And I think that that's especially important considering one, how visual, I mean, your farm can really be seen from everywhere, so it is a big impact. But also I've been looking that it's been a great place for people during COVID to go and sort of like be in contact with nature. So if you could tell us a little bit more and how do you engage with the community on that side, that'd be really interesting.
Sure, yeah. Well, as you say, Anna, we're on right on the edge of Dingwall, which is a reasonably sized town, about 5,000 people, and we've always had people visiting the farm to walk or mountain bike or whatever, which is great, and we welcome that. There's a new footpath link between Dingwall and Strathpeffer getting built at the moment, which is also fantastic. So that goes through the farm a bit. So we're really supportive of that. But I think until last year, it hadn't fully dawned on me that there might be the sort of latent interest from people in the town and the area to perhaps have more of an involvement and a say over how we do these kind of woodland projects. So cut a long story short, we've decided that we'd try a community woodland project and we were going to have a public meeting about it, but yeah, that went by the by. So we made a short video about it to introduce the idea, and I linked it to a questionnaire. And that's been great, actually, because the brilliant thing about social media is you can get things out quite widely, quite quickly. And the last time I looked, we'd had over 150 responses to the questionnaire, and it's only been out 10 days. And literally 100% of people said, this is a great idea. And then, they commented on how they would like to be involved, which it kind of really illustrates to me how much appetite there is for getting more involved with woodland and land management type things adjacent to your community. We don't know how that's going to work yet. We just know that there's people who are interested, and we're going to figure that out in the next few months, how that might work. So it's kind of watch this space kind of thing, but it's been an interesting exercise. And
how big a space do you think it might be, or do you have any idea of? Or
is
that something that's also going to be discussed with
people?
Exactly.
No, it will. I think we're talking about maybe 10 acres or so, right next to the town. So it would be literally adjacent to the town. Something in that kind of ballpark.
Yeah, I guess. Well, that's it sort of like links with another question that we have here about diversifying and sort of like how important are trees as a diversifying tool in your farm, and how do you see that? Do you see them more as a tool or just as a feature? How would you describe trees within your context?
They're definitely part of the diversification mix. Yeah, and we've had occasions where we've made a bit of money from trees that have been planted over time, whether through grant schemes or through selling timber. So from that point of view, clearly it's diversification, but it adds to, we have some rural tourism here on the farm in a very small scale, but making a more attractive environment for people to visit has benefits from that point of view. It provides biomass and all these other things. So yeah, I definitely view it as a diversification thing, both economically and sort of in the wider sense of the word.
And that's really interesting. Do you think are there any concerns or challenging perceptions that farmers and crofters may have about agroforestry or woodland creation on agricultural land, and how would you sort of like convince them that it's worth putting some trees in your farm?
I mean, I suppose in the bigger picture, I think the biggest concern is from a farming point of view is loss of agricultural land to forestry, and there are some unfortunate examples, I think, because of the way that tax structures and incentives work, where land is more valuable from a forestry point of view than from a farming point of view. It's a pity, because in my view, we need to be integrating these things. It's not an either or situation. So there's probably in some quarters a real and genuine concern from that point of view. I think for a lot of people, it's just not having the time and scope to even try and get your head around considering how it might integrate with the farm, or not seeing it as important on the farm. Those might be some of the reasons why it isn't happening at the moment. That's probably gradually changing over time, and and we're in the fortunate position where people like Helen and colleagues are able to offer really helpful advice and guidance. And I mean, my experience dealing with Scottish Forestry has always been really positive. It might be because I can literally see the office from here, so it's not too much of a hassle to come and have a look. But yeah, so for people who are perhaps nervous getting people in to help and advise, whether it's from Scottish Forestry or or other consultants, I think maybe start to help that allay some of those fears. But there are bigger, more worrying trends that I've talked about that way beyond my pay grade anyway.
How do you think trees are gonna? This is a question that came actually from the islands, from someone who can be here. But she's asking, how do you think trees can help or will be impacted with the changing weather patterns, so the climate change? And do you see trees being part of the solution, of potential features that are going to be affected? How do you see them playing in the wider climate change situation?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're definitely going to help. Apart from anything else, they're quite good at storing carbon. But also, I think they do. I mean, for me, it's about resilience to these sorts of changes. I mean, the last 2 years we had a drought a year and a half ago, and then unbelievably wet summer the following year. And I think trees aren't the answer to that, but they can help in some situations, whether it's agroforestry and those examples that I've talked about, providing more when it's been raining for a month, and my cattle are outside all year pretty much. The place that they love to be in the depths of winter is in some open woodland, and so that when we get these horrible wet winters, the trees make the place more resilient from that point of view, and there are all the other benefits to flood risk and things as well. So trying to anticipate, I think maybe the question alluding to trying to anticipate climate change and adapting species, that is a tricky one actually. And yeah, it's hard to guess really, or estimate what the climate's going to be like in 50 years where you are, and try and plant trees accordingly. I don't know how you go about doing that actually. That is a challenge.
Here's a good question from Lorna, and it can be either for Richard or Helen. It's, do you have any views on how we can gain more carbon accreditation or recognition in financial terms for tree planting? Because trees over 20 years seem to be disregarded as being carbon friendly at present, and that is a shame, and even might be even discriminatory. Any views would be interesting to hear. So if anybody else in the call, I mean in the event, wants to say something about it, feel free. But we can start with Richard.
First answer, we haven't done any of that. I have looked into it actually, partly for sort of my wider work, and yeah, I think as the question alluded to, my understanding is it can only apply to newly created woodlands, so up to 2 or 3 years old. But the process is fairly, if you are in that situation, the process is fairly clear and defined. So there's an accreditation through the Woodland Carbon Code that you can go through, and then once you've done that, you can sell your carbon credits on the open market. So yeah, and actually, when I did look into it, I thought, gosh, it is potentially quite lucrative, really, and it's on top of grants that you would get from Scottish Forestry. So yeah, but the problem is I think existing woodlands don't meet the criteria. Yeah, which is a pity if you're in that situation.
Well, John's mentioning here that post-Brexit agricultural grants are supposedly being based on improving biodiversity and community access, which might be another incentive to diversify from conventional farming methods, along the lines of what you've been talking about, Richard. So maybe this can even be part of that.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, what the post-Brexit policy thing's going to look like is anyone's guess, and we're not as advanced in Scotland as other parts of the UK in our thinking. So, but yeah, it's a fair. I think you're right. It's a fair bet that it's going to move more towards that. So, because of all the benefits that woodlands provide, you think, well, there are, if anything's going to be incentivized, then woodland creation and management and everything that goes with that is going to be pretty high on the list.
That's great. Helen, do you want to sort of like say something else, or?
I don't think I can add much. Yeah, as Richard says, the Woodland Carbon Code is there, but that is just for kind of newly planted woodlands. I think that's mainly because existing woodlands can be really mixed age structures, and that becomes quite hard to measure and then turn into a model of how much carbon they're absorbing. Yeah, it would be great to see that being worked on in the future, but I'm not sure if there's any projects underway to do that yet. But new woodlands, it's all same age, and the growth rates can be modelled, so it's a lot easier to come up with that calculation. But yeah, hopefully it's something that will come for older woodlands in time.
Super, and we're almost at the very end of our discussion. So, Richard, I was wondering if there's anything that you would like to add up that you've not said, or some words of hope, I guess, for anybody thinking about planting in the way that you're doing, considering diversity and considering biodiversity in particular within their farms.
Well, I would just encourage people to do it and to learn more about it. If you're at the stage where you're thinking about it, then yeah, it's a really good thing to do. And yeah, get stuck in, and there are plenty of people out there who'll be keen to help you. Should maybe mention the Woodland Trust have advisors as well, and they have more trees, more hedges grants as well. So that they're in the mix of people who can help as well. So yeah, I would go for it.
And if you have any doubts, you can always ask Helen, so directly, which her email is going to be shared with everyone as well. So thank you so much, Richard. Thank you so much, Helen. It's great to talk to someone who's actually doing it, and sort of like it's not afraid of to show that all the ugly parts if you want, or just the parts that's not ugly, but just the parts that are not sort of like perfect if you want. And it's super inspiring what you're doing. I would definitely sort of like encourage everyone to visit the website, both your personal website and the farm. And the Instagram, if you have a while and you want to see amazing pictures, really beautiful pictures, go to it. All that information is going to be shared in the follow-up email. And if you have any more questions afterwards, again, I know that I do that. I start thinking about what I've heard, and then 5 hours afterwards, I have a question. Send them my way. We'll make sure to answer everything in a follow-up email, where we'll also include a lot of information. If you have resources you want to share, if you have resources you want to ask for, please feel free. And I'm going to go on a limb here and sort of like say, if you have more questions, especially about the community side of things, I'm happy to funnel them and make them comprehensible in one little beautiful bunch for Richard to answer afterwards. And sort of like, I'm happy to be the messenger if you want to learn a little bit more. All the information for Richard is also going to be there. If you want to torture him directly, feel free. And if you have any more questions, just happy to do it. Also, keep an eye on our Space in the Soil Association website for events. We're going to be running a few more events about woodland creation from here until the end of the year. There's also a couple of events on direct sales if you're interested in food hubs in your area. And so we'll welcome you to come over to any events and also give us ideas of what you'd like to see next. So thank you very much, Richard. Again, absolutely lovely. Helen, great that you're here. It's always easier to talk to the experts afterwards when you've seen their faces. So great to have you here, and have a lovely, lovely day, everyone. And thanks for coming.